Agatha. You know the drill, right? As always, I'm counting on you. With these words and his usual smile, my boss, Jack, handed me some documents. I quickly skimmed through the documents and replied that I understood. Once Jack left the office and was out of sight, I rested my forehead on my desk and let out a heavy sigh. My name is Agatha. I work in sales at a company that provides custom design and manufacture of specialized equipment used in food factories and automotive industry. My job mainly involved coordinating with the subsidiaries of our company, and I rarely had to go to business meetings with the actual clients. In these coordination, I hardly ever had a major role. My main job was to accompany Jack to various subsidiary factories, discussing budgets and deadlines for the equipment parts we wanted them to make and then preparing the reports. Jack was a promising elite worker. His performance stood out even among other salespeople, and both his colleagues and seniors were counting on him. Yet, working under such a person, I didn't feel like I'd grown at all as a salesperson. It seemed that people like him were chosen from the start. Feeling bad about myself, I would tap my cheeks lightly and face my computer screen. That became my daily routine. However, there was a small happiness in my life. I found it enjoyable to have dinner with my beloved family. The only things that would give me emotional support were my kind-hearted husband and my young school-age son with lots of energy. Sometimes, I would get home a bit late, but my husband, concerned, would help prepare dinner, and seeing this, my son would also help by bringing plates to the table. Surrounded by my family at the dinner table, listening to my son's stories about elementary school, I would find solace every day. Because of my family, I somehow managed to do my best at the housework and my job. Then one weekend, both my husband and I were able to take a few days off, so we decided to visit my parents' house, which wasn't far from where we lived. When we arrived, my father greeted us with a smile, and I felt a bit relieved. We had lunch delivered and spent time leisurely. My son seemed to enjoy his time with his grandpa, whom he hadn't seen in a while. My father's now become a cheerful person, but he used to be terribly depressed, having lost my mother, his beloved wife, just before his retirement. I have 2 older brothers, and my father worked hard in a factory to support the family of 5. For him, my mother was someone who emotionally supported him while he devoted himself to his job. Even after her passing, my father continued to work until his retirement, as if trying to forget his loss. But after retiring, he seemed like a person who had no soul. Though I was concerned about him, being the closest geographically but busy with work, I couldn't visit him often, and my brothers, living far away with their families, found it difficult to care for him too. Just when we siblings were worried, our father found joy in a volunteer activity he tried one day. He began living life with a smile, and we, considering putting him in an aged care facility, were deeply relieved. I was reminiscing about all that, having a relaxed moment after lunch, when my father suddenly said something unbelievable. "Oh, that's right. From next week, I'll start working at a factory, owned by the company you work for, Agatha." My father, working at a factory owned by my company. The moment I heard those words, I felt my heart began beating fast. Trying not to show my shock, I gently expressed my concern to my father, pointing out that he didn't need to push himself since he wasn't in need of money. However, he was enthusiastic, explaining that he had gained physical strength from his volunteer activities and would be an immediate asset due to his recent work in a factory. I honestly couldn't agree with my father working, but seeing him so lively and cheerful, I couldn't oppose him strongly and just nodded silently. In response, he reassured me with a smile, saying that he wouldn't get in my way. One day, after returning from our usual rounds at the subsidiary factories with Jack, he handed me the day's documents with his usual smile and asked if I knew what to do. Forcing a smile, I replied in the affirmative, holding the documents in my hand. As I started to work on the documents, typing on my keyboard, I suddenly heard a male voice nearby and quickly hid the documents. Apprehensively looking towards where the voice came from, I saw President Anderson standing there, smiling at the surprised sales department staff. He said he came to talk to the ace of the sales team after hearing good things from other executives. Of course, President Anderson was here to see Jack, praising him in front of everyone for managing to start production with low budgets and earlier deadlines because of his adjustments. As Jack, in response to the President Anderson's question about his techniques, proudly began to talk about the importance of trust in relationships with factories, I felt a tightening pain in my chest. Pressing my chest to ease the pain, I let out a deep breath after Jack and President Anderson walked away. Then, looking at their diminishing figures, I began creating the report as usual. A few days after this incident, Jack, seemingly motivated by the praise and expectations from President Anderson, brought in a new contract. Accordingly, we went to a subsidiary factory responsible for the production of intricate parts. Following a cheerful Jack, I realized something when we arrived at the factory and went pale. That was the factory where my father said he would be working. Realizing this, I broke into a cold sweat, but knew I had to continue my work as usual. As Jack cheerfully called out to the factory manager, George, and handed him the instruction sheet with a smile, I couldn't bear to watch and involuntarily looked away. This was the usual way of Jack, the ace of sales. Each time, he would set challenging budgets and deadlines for the factory, instructing them on the production and assembly of equipment parts. Even if George and his team reluctantly smiled at those tough conditions, Jack would press on with an unwavering smile. Having financial troubles and yet unable to handle even this level of work after we bailed you out? Well, that's fine. You're not the only option we have. A factory that can't even handle its job properly can be cut off anytime, Jack threatened. This was how Jack would intimidate the subsidiary factories that our parent company had financially revived, leading to George and his team always complying without resistance. When George, with a grim face, was about to nod in agreement, an employee suddenly stood up to defend him. Sorry for interrupting, but isn't that a bit unreasonable? Just because it's a subsidiary factory doesn't mean you shouldn't properly discuss budgets and deadlines. The employee confronted Jack, and that employee was my father. I stood there, dumbfounded. Even the usually compliant George seemed moved by my father's words, opposing Jack for the first time, asking for more time to think it over. Jack's usual smile disappeared, replaced by an irritated look. He clicked his tongue and glared at my father. Why is this old man even working in your factory? Butting in unnecessarily. He should just stick to cleaning toilets at train stations. Jack spat out disdainfully, warning George he'd return the next day, and walked off. Startled, I was about to follow Jack when I met my father's gaze. Frightened by his intense look, I quickly chased after Jack without a word. Back at the office, I was left alone to face the computer, burdened with extra work by the grumpy Jack. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't stop thinking about my father defending George and his piercing gaze. Repeatedly scratching my head in frustration. Taking a deep breath, I pulled a bundle of documents from my desk drawer. As I stared at them, I had mixed feelings, causing my hands to shake. To calm myself down, I took another deep breath and bit my lip as I again stared at the document. For some reason, I tasted the metallic flavor in my mouth, but I began my final task of the day. The next day, I accompanied Jack to the factory again, with the same instruction sheet as we had the day before. George, appearing in a cold sweat when called by Jack, seemed somewhat emboldened by my father's defiance the previous day, making a rare request to discuss things with Jack. Jack, sighing and annoyed by the trouble caused by my father, told George to bring him there. However, George hesitated and said my father hadn't arrived yet, which prompted Jack to smirk unpleasantly. That old man is late today? Or maybe he got scared and ran away? Jack mocked. I clenched my fists in response to his words, but words stuck in my throat. Realizing there was no further resistance, Jack asked George to comply, demanding his signature of approval on the instructions. As I turned away from a completely disheartened George, the factory's entrance door opened, and my father, with a serious expression, walked in. Seeing my father, Jack twisted his face in annoyance, but the next moment, he turned pale when he saw a group of men in black suits walking in behind my father. It was because those in black suits were the executives of our company, and right next to my father was President Anderson, glaring at us with a cold expression. The executives, coming closer, glared at Jack and sighed, remarking on the true nature of the ace. President Anderson, standing beside my father, began to recount the events leading up to this moment, watching Jack, who looked utterly helpless. Apparently, President Anderson had always felt uneasy about Jack's excessively outstanding performance. He had his suspicions, but never caught Jack red-handed. despite having direct conversations with him and seeing how well Jack obscured his sales tactics. President Anderson, who had been speaking up to that point, turned to my father sitting next to him, smiled, and thanked him for his help. My father also smiled back and said he was glad to hear that. I was astonished to learn about my father's involvement in this whole affair. Then, President Anderson turned to Jack with a smile and slowly began to speak. Well, what about the unfair treatment to George, and the tampering with the instructions and reports? Let's go back to the office and discuss this in detail, shall we? President Anderson said. Hearing his words and being glared at by the executives, Jack began to walk away, looking unsteady. I was about to follow him, hanging my head in shame, when suddenly President Anderson called out to me, which made me tremble. He smiled and noted that the documents Jack handed in yesterday were written by me. In disbelief, I whispered, questioning how he knew. The day before, I gathered the instructions and the tampered reports, hoping the discrepancies would be noticed, and left them on sales manager Alex's desk. It seemed Alex noticed them early in the morning and informed President Anderson. Caught off guard that he realized I was the one who placed the documents, I stood there perplexed. Then President Anderson kindly put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You were the only one who could do this, having worked with Jack all this time. It must have been hard being pushed to the limit. I'm truly sorry for not realizing it sooner." Tears started to stream down my face at his words. President Anderson gently patted my back as I cried like a child. Due to this incident, it became clear to everyone that Jack's achievements were not praiseworthy at all. In fact, he had been threatening not only George but others as well. Consequently, Jack was dismissed. I had braced myself for the same fate. Thanks to President Anderson and Alex, saying they wouldn't have known what Jack was doing without my actions, I only faced a few months of salary reduction. After that, I took over some of the projects that Jack had been handling, working independently and negotiating with George. I found a sense of fulfillment in setting fair budgets and deadlines. Gradually, I began to regain confidence in myself. As time passed, my performance at work steadily improved, which further boosted my self-esteem. One day after concluding a meeting and having a casual chat with George at the factory where my father was still working, I was about to leave when something struck me. I remembered how President Anderson and my father called each other by their first names that day. Curious, I asked my father about it during his break. He replied with a sly grin, suggesting we meet at a bar after work. Though puzzled by his smile, I returned to work. That evening, I went to the bar to see my father. There, I found him and President Anderson sitting and waiting for me. I obediently took a seat, but I was so surprised to see President Anderson there that I was at a loss for words. Ignoring my astonishment, my father began to share the story of how he met President Anderson. After my mother's death, my father felt a deep emptiness staying all by himself at home and started frequenting this nearby bar. One day, he overheard a group of men, around his age, discussing old games like marbles and spinning tops. President Anderson, who was one of the men in that group, noticed my father's interest and invited him to join them. This group was involved in a volunteer activity, teaching traditional games to modern children. And they were planning the next activity for the kids. My father, recalling how he had taught my grandson to play yo-yo, shared that story with the group, leading President Anderson to invite him to their next volunteer activity. Trying it out, my father found joy in interacting with the children, which gradually became a new purpose in his life. Moreover, his friendship with President Anderson at the bar added vitality to his life. One day, President Anderson, while drunk, inadvertently mentioned his suspicion about possible fraudulent activities within the company's sales department but expressed frustration over the lack of evidence. Wanting to repay President Anderson for giving him a purpose in life, my father offered to help investigate. Given that he worked at a factory all his life and knew what to do, he ensured that he wouldn't be a burden. Initially, President Anderson declined, not wanting to put a burden on my father, but he eventually agreed, appreciating my father's desire to help. I was stunned to learn about their unique connection. My father then turned to me with a surprised and stern look, having not expected his daughter to be involved in such shady dealings. As I lowered my eyes under my father's gaze, he gave a smile and spoke kindly to me. "I knew you weren't doing this because you wanted to. Your mother hoped that you would be kind to everyone when you were born. As a father, I know there was no way you would treat others poorly. You're just like your mother hoped, a kind person. Hearing my father's words, tears streamed down my face. President Anderson kindly offered me a handkerchief, and with a warm smile, he gently encouraged me to take better care of myself. My father continues to work at our subsidiary factory, finding joy in his work. He is still active in volunteer work. He happily told me he was a yo-yo master and very popular among the children. With that in mind, I can't afford to be outdone. Determined not to be outshone by my father, who's enjoying life so much at his age, I took a deep breath and greeted George, the factory manager, with a smile. Good morning. Thank you for always being so helpful. May we discuss the next request?